Evening, everyone. Welcome to our panel discussion that is being organized by the Center for Public Interest Law. I welcome you all on behalf of the Center. This is being organized in collaboration with Article 14. And we have with us two very, very important speakers, Tish Sanghera, who is an independent journalist, and she works extensively on data-driven journalism that lies at the intersection of social, political, and economic issues through a human rights lens. Today, she will be having a discussion about her five-part series, Environment Undone. The title of the session today is Environment Undone, Applying Investigative Journalism to Environmental Law. Our discussant for the day is my very dear colleague, Kanika Jamwal from the law school, who is a lecturer and specializes in environmental law and specifically transnational environmental law that lies at the intersection of human rights. I welcome both of you, and I'm very, very happy to have the two of you on our panel discussion today. I request the two of you to take the floor now. Thank you.
Right, thank you so much, Bhavani, and a very good evening to all of you. And thank you so much for joining us. Thank you, Tish, for joining us today. And Bhavani has given us a very generous introduction. So I think I'll take this opportunity to jump straight into our conversation, Tish. But before we begin, just some information for the audience. So we'll take up questions from the audience at the end of the session. And Tish has very graciously also agreed to answer any questions that you may have about environmental journalism as a profession. So in addition to questions that you may have about the talk, you can also ask questions about environmental journalism. Okay, so Tish, let me just begin by asking you about the project that you are working on, the five-part series under the larger theme of Environment Undone. Could you tell us a little about that? What was that about?
Yes, thank you, Kanika. Let me just start by saying thank you for inviting me to talk about this series. It's a real pleasure to sort of go back in time a little bit and revisit the stories. So Environment Undone was a project that I worked on with my colleague Disha Shetty for over a year, from about mid-2019 to mid-2020. And the project involved us traveling across India, reporting on infrastructure projects which had been granted environmental clearance, but where it was clear these projects would have huge environmental damage and devastating consequences for local populations. The idea for this project really came about because if you remember in around 2019, there was a lot of government rhetoric at the time talking about India becoming a $5 trillion economy in 5 years' time by 2024, and a lot of investment towards infrastructure projects. And we were really thinking, okay, this means the environment will surely come under a lot of stress and increasing pressure. So we had also at the time been talking to a lot of environmentalists and activists who were concerned also about the Ministry of Environment sort of becoming known for its rubber stamp authority and for the rate of clearances to be sort of increasing. I think it was the Center for Science and Environment, which released a report at the time saying the rejection rate for environmental clearances had shrunk to something crazy like, close to 0%, let's say 1%. So this got us thinking, how could this be the case? How are these clearances just flying out of the ministry? How are these projects being pushed through? Does this mean that regulations are not being adhered to? Does this mean that safeguards are being weakened? So Environment Undone really sort of goes deep into these issues, we think. We were also interested in where these projects were that were being approved so fast. So there is an interactive map element along with the 5 articles that we wrote. So we, using the Parivesh data portal of the Ministry of Environment, we scraped a lot of data on these 2,000 plus projects which had been cleared since 2014 when the portal was made available, and we mapped these projects. And we also included the boundaries of protected areas and wildlife reserves on the project to just really give people an idea of what is happening with these clearances and to put them into some sort of context. So that's sort of what Environment Undone is. I chose to cover 2 projects in particular. So I went on the ground to visit the Ken-Betwa Interlinking River project, and also I think a story which we're going to discuss based in Singrauli, which is a new coal mine which was being opened up there. Yeah.
Right. Yes, actually, I have had the opportunity to read the piece that you wrote on the Singrauli coal mine, and I found that quite interesting in the sense that, I mean, of course, we're going to talk about it now, but just the social impact of the project and the extent to which that spread. I think that was something which was very interesting. So, what was exactly happening in Singrauli? Like, what was the story about this coal mine that you covered there?
Yeah, so Singrauli is in the heart of India, in Madhya Pradesh, in India's coal belt, and a lot of you will know, it's India's energy capital. You go there, and it's just full of coal plants and their complexes. It has a very corporate feel. There's also huge open cast mining happening there, so that the environment is very clearly sort of already disturbed. And this has been going on for about 50 years, so it's already one of the most heavily polluted areas in India. So I was there to visit another parcel of land in Singrauli, which has been set aside for another open cast coal mine, and that area it's situated near the Mahan forest and the Mahan coal block, which some of you may have heard of before, because in 2015 there was a very famous Greenpeace campaign against a coal plant that was due to be built there. And this was famously, if you remember, I think it was Priya Pillai, who was the lead campaigner at Greenpeace at the time. She was famously stopped from boarding a plane at Delhi airport to go to London and to give her testimony at I think it was a parliamentary standing committee to talk about the impact that this plant would have on the local communities there. So it's already a very sort of controversial area. And so the coal mine that I was there to, potential coal mine that I was there to go and visit, it is in this same area, which is sort of populated by a lot of scheduled tribe communities. It is very densely forested. It is a known tiger corridor. So there are 2 wildlife reserves adjacent to that area. And so it's extremely well known as being sort of not great place to have a coal mine. But when I arrived in Singrauli, so I went to a village called Vidarva, which was listed in all of the forest clearance documents as one of the villages set to be affected. And I went there to talk to the inhabitants of that area to understand, sort of what were their concerns about this mine opening up. And it was really odd, actually, because some people that I spoke to, the first time they heard about this mine potentially being built on their land and, consequently them being displaced from their land, was a sign that appeared, I think in 2017, so a couple of years earlier, simply saying this land has been allocated to THDC, which is the energy company building the mine. So it was really odd. The inhabitants there sort of felt in limbo. A lot of them had pooled together the meager resources they had to send representatives from their community to Jabalpur, like the nearest big city, to try to get some legal assistance. But they maintained that nobody from the company had come to visit them. Nobody had come to do a survey, which is typical of these projects. No one had come to give them any information, really. So it was already clear that there were people's voices not being heard who were heavily affected by this new coal mine.
Right. Okay. Actually, this thing, Tish, that you're talking about, the displacement angle of this project, right? And what you just described, how people had no idea about what was perhaps going to hit them, and they just got this official document telling them that they are going to be moved. This kind of takes me back to when they were building the Sardar Sarovar Dam and what was happening with the indigenous population in that region. And there is this wonderful documentary by Spanner Films called Drowned Out. And I mean, that traces the life of this particular indigenous community and how they also had no information about what was happening, what was going to happen, and they were just told that this land is now being taken. So there is definitely this very significant social sort of impact that this project had. And in addition to displacement, were there any other, visible or perhaps latent social impacts that you could, observe there?
Mm-hmm. Well, I mean, the displacement was really the biggest concern because, these communities, they are really reliant on the forest for their economic and also sort of spiritual needs. So displacement, it's not like potentially like, us moving from city to city or us moving across the country. For them, I visited some of the resettlement colonies of other projects, and these people who have been farmers their whole lives are suddenly put into these colonies where the accommodation is, not up to par. There is a lack of piped water, health facilities, ironically, a lack of electricity supply, despite being in India's energy capital. They're often promised jobs which don't really appear. I mean, I spoke to a man in his 60s, and he said his sons had been given some IT courses by the company, but these promised jobs did not materialize. So they no longer have their land to cultivate or the forest to rely on. A lot of people there, they're part of the Gonds tribal community. They take mahua from the forest and can sell that for quite high sums during the season. So all of this is lost. So it really has an economic impact as well as just being distressing to be shunted off your land. The health risks of these mines appearing is another thing which shouldn't be taken lightly. I mean, these people are resettled, but they're still in the Singrauli area, so they're still being affected by dirty water bodies, by heavily polluted air. The cancer rates in Singrauli are way above average for the country. That's lung cancer rates predominantly, and fluorosis also because of the polluted water bodies. So, these are all, again, it's an economic pressure when you can't afford to have these elements be treated. And there was a ban on industrial activities put in place in Singrauli, I think, in around 2010, but that ban was lifted in 2014. So that's why these projects can now go ahead. And that sort of shows you that this is not an area which can sort of take any more industrialization of this kind. And the compliance of the projects which are already ongoing in these areas is already, not up to par. And I don't know if any of our viewers will remember, there are occasionally these horrific disasters where you hear of the waste from these mines and coal plants, which are usually stored in sort of open fields. It's kind of a mixture of coal ash and slurry. Sometimes the dam breaks on these giant vats which are holding this waste, and the slurry sort of like, it's like a tsunami of fly ash which just sort of pours into villages. And I think about 2 years ago, 3 people died in instances like this. So these things are quite periodic, and they're very well known about, but the resources to keep these projects in check are not there. So there are many impacts besides the displacement. A lot of the crop yields, for example, in the area have also been affected. So I spoke to farmers who said, before this coal plant next to us came up, we could sort of cultivate, we could make a living from our farm. And now, like the corn that I grow in the summer is 50% than it used to be 20 years ago. I mean, that figure may not actually be the case, but it really feels like for them that the environment has degraded to such an extent that they're not able to survive on it anymore.
Right. So also, I mean, so Tish, it's interesting when you were talking about how this land is not just in the context of displacement. Of course, you spoke about how this land is also important not just for their economic needs but their spiritual needs, right? So of course, because the Bone tribe, perhaps being and qualifying as an indigenous community of the region. So there's also this angle in this conversation. If we look at it from the point of view of environmental law, there's this conversation about indigenous peoples and the rights of and their rights. And I think this is a conversation that we all have in our classes in the environmental law course, that the impact, and I think you also highlight that, right, that the impact that this displacement would have on, say, a community that doesn't identify as an indigenous community as opposed to an indigenous community is going to be very different, because this land is intrinsic to their identity. And for others, for example, it might not, losing that land might not mean losing their identity. But for the indigenous community in the region, perhaps then it means losing their entire identity, right? So that I think I particularly find that aspect very interesting, that you bring out also in your piece on this mind. The other thing that I think uh, would then the whole idea about internal displacement, and there's how there's perhaps, I mean, there's no actually legal framework in India on internally displaced people. As such, you just have socio-economic rights jurisprudence there. Um, but coming back to kind of what you're talking about in terms of health impact assessment, and part of this would also be part of it would also be then social and health impact assessment, and how that kind of in India is a part of environmental impact assessment. So Philip Kulit has written about this extensively, how in India we just have this one large framework of environmental impact assessment, within which then we have HIA and SIA. So I'm just curious as to what was the situation there with regards to environmental clearances, because I think that is again one of your major focus areas in your research. So what was the situation there with regards to EIA and the EC that was given to them?
Yeah. So, as you alluded to, the EIA document is really crucial when applying for an environmental clearance, and it is a document which covers all aspects of a potential project's impact. So, actually, not just the environmental impact in terms of water, air, and land pollution, but also potentially the socio-economic impact of a project. It's meant to be wide-ranging in its appraisal of a project's potential. And a key element of the EIA is, of course, the public hearing and the public consultations. So as the EIA is completed, it's actually meant to be put out into the public domain, and the local communities are able to attend a meeting and air their concerns on the project and on the findings of the EIA. And once that process has been completed, only then is the EIA sort of finalized and the project able to be given environmental clearance. So obviously the EIA for this coal mine in Singrauli would have been extremely interesting to read, and we were and when I was reporting that investigating this, I was very interested to find this document, and in particular to read the meeting minutes of the public hearing. But in looking for that document, I came across an interesting loophole, as it were, which is that environmental clearances, when they are granted, they're actually granted for a period of up to 30 years. And there are some people who would like to expand that to 50 years, as we saw in the recent amendments to the EIA in 2020. But yeah, they're valid for 30 years. And if in that time, as happened with this mine, a project changes hands between different companies, or the land allotted to one company passes hands, that environmental clearance can stay valid, and it can be inherited, as it were, by the next company. So THDC, in this mine's case, inherited the EC from the previous mining company whose mine, for whatever reason, didn't go ahead. So because the EC was inherited, no new EIA document had to be produced, no new assessment and appraisal had to happen, which means no public hearings or consultations also had to go ahead. And this is, I think, pretty crazy. So that this means projects are being greenlit and approved, and we don't know the environmental conditions that may have changed in that 10, 20, up to 30-year period of the environmental clearance being inherited. So this has obviously serious implications for public scrutiny of projects. If the public isn't being consulted, if we don't hear voices from the ground and their concerns, that's a pretty big, I would say, infringement on our rights, on democratic rights. And the EIA, when it was first introduced, was really iconic for having this public hearing mechanism included. The EIA was introduced, I think, in 1994, and this was before we had the RTI Act in India in 2005 that was introduced. This is before this idea of us requesting information was sort of embedded into our sort of civic sense. So it really is iconic, the idea of EIA having these public meetings. But yeah, obviously it's not helpful for projects who want to sort of get on with building their, whatever it is they're building. It is definitely an obstacle, and we've seen consistent attacks on this mechanism for this reason. So another project that I covered, the Ken Betwa project, for example, there we saw public hearings were being held in districts really, really far away from where the project affected families were residing. So even if these public hearings were being advertised, the people affected did not potentially know that they were being held. We also know, and Kanchi Kohli, as you alluded to, has done a lot of work on this, that if these public meetings go ahead, they can be manipulated to ensure that the people attending the meeting are, have been sort of compromised beforehand and won't be saying anything too outlandish. And yeah, there are many ways that the EIA can be manipulated. So it was a real shame, I think, that this EIA was not redone, and that this inheritance sort of loophole, I spoke to experts, is becoming increasingly common. And yeah, I think that's a big problem for public scrutiny.
Okay, so lot of just a lot of things that I could gather from what you were just saying, and I mean, even in the context of the environmental impact assessment notification of 2006, right? So I mean there exists like seminal literature sort of critiquing the 2006 notification on exactly the grounds that you were talking about, and particularly this idea of transferability of an environmental clearance, right? So here is an institution which gets an environmental clearance, and then regardless, I mean, 30 years later, 20 years later, there's another institution, I mean, there's another project developer who comes into picture and says, all right, well, I'm doing this project now, so this clearance is mine. And I think one of the major problems here would then also be that both these developers might not have similar environmental ethics, right? And I think a conversation that goes around or arguments that have been put forth, particularly by Shibani Ghosh in the context of environmental impact assessment, she's a lawyer herself, is that we need a stronger regulatory ethic, right? And there also has to be willingness to abide by laws. And that willingness won't be the same for two different project proponents. So how do you then transfer environmental clearances like that, right? It's obviously going to be different. One person, yeah, sorry, go ahead.
No, I was just going to add one other thing, because this idea of environmental ethics should be present in this in this mechanism, is that there's one other issue with the EIA, which I think needs to be discussed more, is that who are the people carrying out these EIAs? They're often consultants, and who are the consultants paid by? They are paid by the project owners. So I think it's Ritvik Datta at Life. He talks about this a lot. There is an inherent conflict of interest in the very structure of the EIA process. If consultants, that they're taken on board to do these EIAs, and they may be given, for example, a 20% upfront fee. And then the rest of the fee, the 80%, comes when the EIA is completed and the project is approved. So the incentive there is for the project to be approved, and therefore your EIA cannot be discovering all these potential flaws with the project, and that the area is already so polluted. So that is, I would say, non-ethical and sort of needs to be addressed.
Yeah. And I mean, who's the final authority, right? Who's kind of giving the EIA or not? It's at the central level, you have the Ministry of Environment, and then at the state level, you have an expert appraisal. At the state level, you have an Environmental Impact Assessment Authority, which only has one representative of the state government. But all your large projects, then development projects like these, are usually led by one or the other department of the government, and it is finally the deciding authority is also the government. So, over all of these years, that's been the case. And that's such a basic principle of natural justice, right? You can't be a judge in your own case. But, what is surprising, Tish, here is that this structure exists across all countries. This is what exists in the UK as well, where it's even for government projects, the final authority who's granting an EIA, an environmental clearance, or approving an environmental clearance, it's the government itself. So that conflict of interest, like the one that you're talking about here, in terms of it's the consultant is the consultant is hired by the project proponent themselves, right? And they are giving the EIA report on the basis of which then the committee is giving its decision. So a lot of, I think, tensions, and there are a lot of tensions in the process. And I think now, on the point of public hearing also, because you also referred to the draft notification, the public hearing, the time for public hearings has further been curtailed in the draft notification. So, this point about the Ken Betwa project, and how you're talking about how the public hearing was happening somewhere very far away from the project side. Again, I think fundamentally that is an issue, because the law itself also doesn't say that it should happen on the project site, right? That's not a mandatory requirement. It says it should be easily accessible, but nothing beyond that. So that is, I think.
And what is the language that these public hearings are being conducted in? It's another way of sort of keeping the wrong people out, isn't it? I mean, for this Amelia coal mine, these scheduled tribe communities, they are not well educated. They live very remote, in a remote part of Vidarbha. I mean, it's not even a village as we would know it. You need off-road vehicles to get there. So there are a lot of barriers to even participating in this sort of, democracy element of the EIA, even when it's supposedly there. So.
And how things really haven't changed. When I was talking about Narmada, so Narmada Bachao was, Sardar Sarovar Dam was 50 years back now, 1970s it got approval, right? EIA wasn't institutionalized then. And now we have EIA is institutionalized. Public hearing is a mandatory part, but it's when you were telling us what this thing about, like what was happening in Singrauli, like it was, all I could think about was that documentary, how things are still pretty much the same, how people still don't have any idea about what is happening. So also sometimes makes you think about, well, how effective is law actually, or how effective. We are looking at environmental clearances, but is it that the law has loopholes, or is it that there's this complete absence of willingness to implement the law? So I think that also kind of comes out very well from the story that you've covered there. Right. So moving on, you have written about the mine's proximity to inviolate forests, and I think you also mentioned Mahan Forest. I guess was an inviolate forest. So, what is exactly this category of forests, and if you could tell us a little about how is it regulated in law, that would be yeah.
Yes, yes, of course. So this concept of violet forests and inviolate forests, it actually began under the UPA government. So there was an initiative there to sort of assess all of the forested areas in India, which may be opened up for coal mining, and to sort of categorize them into forests which we definitely cannot be allowed to be destroyed for mining. And the terminology at the time was actually go and no-go areas, and it was later changed to violet and inviolate, I think in 2012 or some later time. So these go and no-go areas were sort of put down on paper and were supposed to be used as a definitive sort of framework for where coal mining could go ahead in the country. And now I don't have the figures in front of me, but I think when this first assessment was made, about 56% of all I think of all coal blocks in India contained no-go areas, which was obviously not a great result for the Ministry of Coal, for example, who would want sort of unfettered access as much as possible to the areas where they wanted to coal. So there was a backlash from them, and later this figure was brought down to something, I think, nearer 20%, for example. But this idea of violet, inviolate areas has stayed within the Ministry of Environment. And if you look at any forest clearance documents, you'll often see it being referred to. And one would think that if something is classed as an inviolate forested area, then no mining can happen there. But actually, this framework has no legal standing. So this inviolate, violet concept, it was never sort of converted into a legal notice. It's really just remained as guidelines for people making forest clearance assessments. So actually in this coal mine that in Amelia in Singrauli that I was looking into, the forest clearance document said, I think 8 out of 14 of the inviolate areas can be cleared for mining, and 6 of them we won't go near, which is, it's kind of funny to hear, like yeah, these inviolate areas are fine, just go ahead and do some mining there. So that really shows you that, even if these areas have been classified as no-go or inviolate, really in theory any forested area is never off the table when it comes to coal mining. And yeah, I guess that shouldn't really be a surprise, because when you look at forest clearance documents, for example, and you see the sort of language which is being used by forest officials, I think I'm trying to remember now the exact sentences for this coal mine, but you'll see things written like, oh, mining may be allowed as it's in the national interest, or it's vital for the energy needs of the country. And this is language in a site inspection report, by an FAC official. So it's sort of counterintuitive. You would think that the forest officials, his interest is, he should be territorial over the forests. His interests are to preserve the forests as much as possible. But he's sort of, speaking like an energy minister in this case. So it's really interesting sort of how unprotected in a way forests can be in India.
Right. Also, like when you say that the forest minister is supposed to speak like he's wanting to protect forests, but he's talking like an energy minister, perhaps. I think that's also, I think, somewhere the problem with the whole idea of sustainable development, right? How do we, when we talk about sustainable development, how much is it about focusing on economic development and then trying to save the environment in that process, or trying to minimize the impact on the environment in that process. And I think that somewhere that this irony is also somewhere inbuilt in our environmental clearance process, given how you say that the clearance rate is so high, that so they want to promote development, and in that process they want to minimize harm to the environment. And it just kind of makes one think as to until when will this approach, until when can we actually ascribe to this approach, given how imminent the threat to environment and how imminently climate change is now manifesting itself.
Yeah, and I think nobody is saying here that development should not be going ahead. It's sustainability is the key here, but it is a problem if the Environment Ministry is using, as it does quite often, language such as ease of doing business, and its KPIs is to improve the ease of doing business. And why is an Environment Ministry talking in these ways? That development should go ahead, and India needs and deserves better infrastructure, but surely that is the job of a different ministry, and we need people in the Environment Ministry who understand the sort of pressures on our biodiversity and on our wildlife, and their mandate is that. So there's a lot of, unfortunately, blurring of lines, and India is in no way the exception. The only country doing this. So,
yeah. Just a little, perhaps a more like a more policy-based question, because we're talking about people who are in these institutions and who are, for example, involved also in the process of EIA generally, who's giving clearance, who's in the appraisal committee. Do you think that involving the local community more directly in the process of decision making, say having them as a part of the appraisal committee, do you think that is that desirable, or do you think that we just need to kind of strengthen the current process?
Yeah, I think that's interesting because everybody has their own interests when it comes to projects like this, and for example, the community involved in this mine in Singrauli, they have witnessed so many projects in their region. They've seen the effects on their communities. They know the process, even that someone will come, survey your land, sort of total up what your assets are and try to give you an equivalent amount and move you on. So I think they do understand the process there, and they know how to be involved if they want to. They know sort of what their demands are in a way. They know what to ask for. And potentially, if there was a project which was sort of good to go ahead and did meet certain environment requirements, there would still obviously be natural aversion to it. So I think the involvement in the appraisal process is difficult because you do need sort of environment experts to be leading that, but involvement should be there for sure. There should be a mechanism such as the public meetings for people to at least sort of voice their concerns, and there should be, of course, greater transparency. I mean, there seems to be absolutely no transparency right now when all documents are drafted in English, when things are sort of, when communities are kept out of the dark. So, that's not a very good answer, actually, but I think that there is, certain degrees of involvement are necessary.
Are necessary. No, absolutely. I think I agree with you there. I mean, I have a little different, and again, this is just an argument that perhaps I have made at some point, that I feel that sometimes, ideally we should be strengthening this process as it is and having them maybe not in the appraisal committee but at other stages. But sometimes I also think that perhaps we need to really revisit how we look at experts, right? Do we need to limit it to epistemic experts, or should we perhaps go beyond that and look at local communities who have an understanding of that region? But of course, there are a lot of logistical issues involved there, and how do you then have them be a part of an appraisal committee, and how do you reconcile that space essentially? where you have epistemic experts and say indigenous communities working together. How do we? And there is the UN has mechanisms in place, but can we actually have those implemented in a domestic system? Is something which is obviously something that we could perhaps think about. Yeah, sorry, go ahead.
No, if the will is there, I think that system can be implemented, but that is sort of the issue with especially a sort of central government led system like India's, is that it's not possible right now because the mechanisms of putting that in place are too difficult. But actually, I'll just quickly mention a book that I read recently called The Ministry for the Future by Kim Stanley Robinson. It's it's a fictional novel set in the near future, but India features heavily in it as a sort of policy model because the government has changed hands. There's been certain climate crises that have put the environment center stage for all countries. And India is actually there as a country which has become sort of taken on the mantle of putting the environment first when it comes to development. So it talks about different agricultural models and water recycling methods that the country is using. And it just shows you that a lot of these things, it's because things are so top down when it comes to environmental management, that if the will is there, these things are possible. And in India's culture, I think there is a big sort of inherent relationship with nature that a lot of other countries don't have. And the book really elevates this. It talks India. I don't know if this is actually true, but apparently, India has always talked about the 7 generations before us and the 7 generations ahead of us as a way of looking at sustainability. And it's a very nice alternative future to consider. So I do recommend that book. It's interesting.
Yeah. I mean, yes, something perhaps drawing upon the traditional knowledge that the country has with respect to environmental. Yes, there's a plethora of traditional knowledge. I absolutely kind of align with you on that. Right. So coming back to our conversation, Tish, so you talk about how the need to actually start this mining project arose from the establishment of a coal plant in Khujra, which I believe is close to the National Capital Region. So what do you think, could be the potential impacts of this coal plant, given its proximity to the NCR and the current sort of pollution level in that region particularly?
Yeah, well, as you alluded to, the location of the Khurja plant is something which is quite astonishing. It is 90 kilometers outside of Delhi, and studies have already shown that coal plants within a 300-kilometer radius of the NCR region and of Delhi in particular have really contributed to making this region the worst polluted region in terms of air quality in the world. So if this plant is built, and it looks like it is going to be built, this will undoubtedly contribute to the high level of PM 2.5 particulate matter in the atmosphere. So there is actually a very active NGO called SAFE, which Social Actions for Forest and Environment, which some of you may be aware of, and they have been leading the charge sort of against this plant. And in particular, they've been looking at the EIA and the estimated air quality data in that to sort of say that this project is going ahead because people want it to go ahead despite the obvious ramifications for air quality. So they brought a case to the NGT, and in that they said, please look at the air quality data in this EIA. It must be inaccurate and wrong, because if you look at it, I think, for example, the readings were showing that the air quality is better in the winter than in the summer, or something sort of so ridiculous that it should make anybody reviewing this EIA or the environmental clearance think twice and be like, this needs to be looked at again. So I think, unfortunately, the NGT has closed the case now, but they did ask, I think, IIT Delhi to go back and do another air study. And the readings came back pretty similar, and that's where the case is now. It's sort of ended. But I think the issue there is that the scientists came back to do the air quality study on one day and then left. No one was taking a sort of like multi-week approach to measuring the air quality. But it's not just air quality actually which will be affected. Is it's a very water-stressed region in near Kurja, and as we know, thermal plants require a lot of water to be used in their cooling systems, and the EIA states, sort of X cubic meters of water will be drawn from the Yamuna to cool the plant down, and that should be a concern as well in such a water-stressed region. So it does sort of make you think, why are these plants going ahead? I mean, that's not even to mention the economic sort of impact of this plant. So many think tanks, and there's one Australian think tank in particular, I think it's called IEEFA, they did a report looking at the economic model of the plant, which showed that, this plant being built today in 2022 now, is just entirely illogical when you look at the cost structure of the plant. We know that solar electricity is 14%, roughly 14-15% cheaper than coal-fired electricity in India today. And the problem with coal plants is that there is not enough demand for the energy that they produce. So a lot of them are literally sitting idle for half of the time. This doesn't mean that all Indians have access to electricity all of the time, and that does not mean that we don't need to fix that, but it does mean that these plants are being built and will likely be ending up as stressed assets. And THDC, who is building this plant, is a publicly funded company, so this means literally that tax dollars are going towards this, so everybody has an interest in this plant, literally. So yeah, it's not just the environmental impact, it's also the fact that this plant will be built using outdated technology as well. It's being built with it's called supercritical technology, when there are plants being built in other countries using ultra-critical technology. I think China is already decommissioning supercritical plants, the same plant which India wants to build now today. So yeah, it's just a whole mess. And I didn't include this in my story, but some people have said, there's another plant approved in the same week or 2 weeks after the Kurja plant was approved, granted its EC in Bihar, in Bixar, I think. And someone alluded to, national elections taking place, and that really is sort of the only conclusion you can come to when you look at the economic cost structure involved and the environmental impact.
Yes, I think with this, I mean, one of the insights that perhaps I have here is how, and this is something that I always sort of communicate in the class as well, that when you're looking at environmental issues or environmental regulations, you kind of need to take a political economy approach, right? You can't just look at them in absolute vacuum. You need to understand what were the political and economic conditions at the time that perhaps led to that regulation, and how then does the meaning of environmental rights also change when we're looking at the political and economic context of a particular issue. So yeah, I think what you were just talking about really gives us a sense of what was sort of the economic and the political background there.
Especially for projects like these, I mean, they take, in this case, literally a decade to get off the ground. So as we're saying, the political and economic situation has changed drastically from the first day that this plant was proposed. India's electricity needs were very different 10 years ago in the state of UP to what they are today. And we need our sort of projects to keep up with that, and that's not happening. So yeah, 100% agree with what you said.
Okay, so Tish, my last question to you is on a more sort of it's a little more zoomed out, perhaps for the lack of a better word. So we recently had the COP26 conference, and a lot of countries came together making made very ambitious pledges, and India also made a pledge there with regards to having net zero carbon emissions by the year 2070, I believe. So how do you think, in the context of particularly what you saw on the field with regards to what was happening in Singrauli and generally in your project in Environment Undone. How do you think, where do you think we stand on that pledge?
Yeah, so I mean, firstly, I'll say that the pledge for net zero by 2070 is completely reasonable for India, for a country like India. I think it was unfair that a lot of international media especially criticized this date, saying it was, you know, way too late and not ambitious enough. Developing countries have not walked the talk on supporting other developed countries have not supported other developed countries on their green transition, and in particular providing the development finance needed for it. So I think there shouldn't be too much focus on the 2070 date, because I think it's a good signal that India has given a date at all and is acting to make this transition to a low carbon future. So the sort of, you know, the historical balance of emissions is already tilted, you know, way away from India. India has contributed like 5% of cumulative carbon dioxide emissions compared to 20% by the US or something similar. So, I mean, that doesn't go to say that India should not and does not need to urgently ramp up its green energy provisions and put in place a low carbon economy, because we know, unfortunately, countries like India will be the most affected by the climate crisis, and it will have devastating consequences for the poorest and most marginalized communities in India. But I think really the focus has to be not on reducing India's emissions so much as sort of avoiding that they happen in the first place. So when thinking about the coal plant, for example, that I reported on, I think if I were to wave a magic wand, it would be taking the funds attributed to that, which is about 1.6 billion US dollars, and cancelling that coal plant and putting it in investments in solar and wind energy. So basically, we need India to not follow the same development path as China, for example, which has had the fastest development of any country, you know, in the last 50, 60 years, but got to the point of where it is today as the world's largest economy by emitting a whole host of carbon into the atmosphere. So India's focus really needs to be on developing in a sustainable way and in a low carbon way, but that is of course more easier said than done, and no country has done this, has figured out how to do, you know, low carbon urbanization, green urbanization. So the challenge is obviously, you know, a huge one, and we don't even have the technology potentially yet, which countries like India will require. But you know, I think, like, for example, the goal for, was it 500 gigawatts of renewable energy by 2030? It does sound good, but it also, I think, is more of a ambition and a commitment to becoming green and to fighting the climate crisis than actually an achievable goal. And that is because, you know, a lot of the economic aspect I was alluding to earlier, the fact that we have a lot of publicly funded companies still investing in coal technology, which you know, our national grid right now is where the investment needs to be. So, I mean, we have, as I said, you know, these coal plants producing energy, and it's not even being used. For the demand for it isn't there. But if the investments went into the national grid, and at the same time we invested in the solar and wind and the batteries needed to store this energy and distribute it around the country, then that would be a much better solution. So, I think, to conclude, I'm not disheartened by India's 2070 pledge, and I think COP26, with China not being there, India sort of rose to the occasion and provided some good news for all of us. But I would like to see, for example, hydropower being taken out as part of India's renewable energy mix, because frankly, hydropower in the Himalayas is disastrous, frankly, for climate. So that sort of stuff is quite concerning. And actually, we were planning to do an article for the Environment Undone series in Arunachal Pradesh, focusing on the hydropower project in the Dibang Valley, but COVID was just about starting off, and we were about to go to war with China, it looked like, so that project couldn't take place. But yeah, I think if anything, more investments in coal power plants is economic suicide, basically, for any country right now. So I would like to see more support for countries like India to move away from those type of investments, because it is not really possible for India to phase out coal completely. And I think the Prime Minister's pledge for $1 trillion for developing countries at COP26 was a headline figure, but it's 100% what is needed, because we can't make this transition alone. And yeah, that's where I stand.
No,
so
I absolutely
a passionate rant there a little bit, but yeah.
No, but I absolutely agree with you, when you say that there needs to be a lot of international support here. And I think even as per the Paris Agreement at this point, like, all countries need to take mitigation obligations, right? The only difference is in the financial obligations, where Paris very clearly states that the developed countries need to finance the transition that developing and underdeveloped countries are going through. So I think in that sense, I think I absolutely align with you that we can't do it alone. There needs to be a lot of investment flowing from the global north into developing countries like India to be able to undertake this transition successfully and truly so. Even as per historic responsibility, if we even take that angle, I think it's only justified to then sort of want that. All right, that brings me to an end of the questions that I have. I am opening this discussion up to the audience, and Bhavani is here. So yeah, audience, in case there are any questions, please feel free to ask them.
Thank you, Tish and Kanika. This was really, really fascinating. And the way you've weaved in academic and policy questions around investigative journalism, with specifically this coal plant, has been very interesting. With now, we open the floor for questions. If anybody wants to ask the speakers directly, please raise your hand, or you can drop your question in the chat box, and we'll read it for you. Okay, I think we have a question from Samar in the audience. Hello, Samar.
Hi, Bhavani. Hi, Tish.
Hello.
And hi, Kanika. My question was, in all your reporting, what was the reactions you found from local government officials? Were they mixed? Were they uniformly allied with the government and against the sensitivities of local communities? And were they in line with the law of the land as it stood?
Yes, thank you for that. So I'll talk about the coal mining project in particular. So firstly, getting hold of a government official when we were on the ground a lot of the time was extremely difficult, and also extremely infuriating, because they are obviously a key actor in all of these projects, and we were very conscious of not representing their view. So for the coal mining project, for example, I was there for 5 days in Singrauli and desperately trying to meet with a district collector or just somebody who I could talk to. And I also felt sort of the responsibility to talk to these people, because I had just spent time with the local communities and they hadn't been able to talk to any sort of authority figure at all. So I was desperately trying to meet with somebody, but it really just didn't happen. And then we quickly fell into the COVID lockdown as we were finishing up all of these articles, which just added another layer of distance between us and the government officials. And I remember, talking with my partner Disha and our editor, and we were really concerned that we were not getting these voices into the stories, and that would potentially, make a lot of these stories invalid if the government officials were not represented. So we had phone numbers that we had found for local government officials. We had various contacts who said that they could put us in touch. And I did eventually get to have a conversation with the district collector, but because it was COVID, because it was over the phone, I was a bit disappointed that I felt he was sort of, giving pre-agreed lines. For example, I was asking him, a lot of the communities I've spoken to have said that nobody has come to do a survey. They just had nobody come onto the land and meet with them. And the district collector was just sort of, I think, repeating things that he often says, which is like, oh, rest assured, somebody will meet them, or don't worry, all due procedures will be followed. It was really frustrating, actually. And I felt that if I was in the room with somebody, it would have been different. So, and I know my partner, Disha, would agree with me, if there was anything we could sort of change about the project, it would be to amplify those local government officials more and to ask the questions that you just asked, Summer.
Right, thank you.
Thank you, Samar. We see Piyush has a question. Please go ahead, Piyush.
Thank you, ma'am. And we are very happy that there is someone on ground reality working on the actual phase of environmental clearance. Though the fact that we have a strict regime of EIA and also with Ministry of Environment, we have seen that almost 7,847 clearances have been made recently in 2021. But there is still something which lacks in the regime and law itself, and also the ground reality hasn't been able to cope with it. The fact that we have seen certain instances of this LG polymers gas leak case, and there is oil blast in Assam. So later we found that there was no EIA clearance at all. And these projects have been operating since years. How can we unsee these, and where are these mismatch coming from, and why there is such lack of transparency? How do this ministry and all the people see this?
Yeah, thank you for your question. I think you're asking, how can this be possible? How can these projects be operating without these basic clearances in place? And to be honest, I don't know that, because I don't know what is going on within the ministries. But from what I can tell, for example, reading the environment clearance documents and minutes of the EAC meetings, is that the basic problem is that we don't have experts on these committees who are approving these projects in the first place. And we spoke to a lot of environmental activists who said that is becoming somewhat intentional, that you have people on the committees who are not experts, for example, in the field of chemical industries or in the field of coal mining. And they are really sort of even becoming increasingly political appointees, and who are there to really approve projects and get out of there. So the CSC, the Center for Science and Environment, they had a very interesting study looking at the time that these committees were meeting for, and how many projects that they approved within that meeting. And in some cases, they met for example, let's say 30 minutes and approved 3 or 4 projects in that meeting. So you have to ask yourself, how could that be happening? And if they're approving projects so fast, then they must be missing details like these environmental clearances, or important details on the safety of these projects, as you alluded to. That, in my mind, must be one of the only ways that these sort of mistakes are happening. And it's, as I said earlier, because the ministry is sort of getting reorganized into a sort of commercial arm of the government, right? The focus is on the ease of doing business. We have ministers who have held the environment portfolio along with the heavy industries ministry in their portfolio as well. I mean, how is that not a conflict of interest if you have the same government minister overseeing both both. So I'm sorry, I don't have a concrete example because I'm not sure kind of what happens in the corridors of power, but I can only imagine that if this is the way that the committees are operating and this is how projects are being approved, it must be because things like this are slipping through the net.
Ma'am, also one question. Ministry of Environment has also come up with an idea saying that the polluting projects which are operating, time before, they have come with the concept that they can self-declare that they are not polluting anymore. They are already polluting, but they are coming with the idea of self-declaration that you just give us a certificate or declaration that you will not pollute from sins. So how we are going to solve this? Because self-declaration is a potential threat to this environment, ma'am.
Yeah, 100%. That sort of, as we were talking about earlier, the ethical sort of core of the environmental ministry and all the regulations that we have in place is missing, right? So self-reporting is just a non-starter from the beginning. But I mean, even I think going back to when I was talking about the compliance of coal mines in Singrauli, already the resources available for compliance are so low that even if you have people not self-reporting and you have a potential, a pollution board that is meant to be doing the reporting, that also isn't a guarantee. So how do we fix this? That's a very, very good question. And I can only say that, more resources, but also just more priorities placed on pollution management in the first place is required, right? It's not a priority right now. So there is no way that resources are ever going to be allocated to this place. I mean, Singrauli, for instance, doesn't even have a lab measuring the different water, air, and land pollution that is happening. And I spoke to people in the area who said, we've actually been just asking for this very simple thing for a very long time, which is just to have a lab in this area to not even put pressure on people to reduce the pollution, but to just measure the pollution that's happening in the first place. And these are communities which are already affected with cancer and fluorosis. So yeah, in terms of priorities, I think sort of self-reporting is happening because nobody cares to do anything different, and that's a very pessimistic view, but that's where I've come to after this series.
Thank you, ma'am. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Piyush, for your question. Piyush had very policy-based questions. So Kanika, I wanted to know if you could also comment on them.
So yeah, I wanted to actually very quickly add on to what Piyush was asking in the first question, particularly how are these projects happening, working without environmental clearance. And just to add to what Tish was saying. So, I mean, if you look at the procedure for an environmental clearance, right? So you need an environmental clearance first, and then you can apply to establish your industry with the State Pollution Control Board. Now, presumably, when these industries applied for a license to operate with the SPCB, they should have shown a valid environmental clearance. The only situation where they don't need an environmental clearance is if the appraisal committee at the first stage, which is your, I think it's called scoping, the screening stage, decides that this is a category B project, meaning thereby that it's particularly category B2. Category B2 projects are small projects that don't then need an environmental clearance. So a lot of times what also happens is that bigger projects are broken into smaller parts and shown as independent projects to then fall into the category of B2, and then they're just cleared like that. They don't need an environmental impact assessment and they're just cleared. And I mean, subsequently, actually, when this case came up, I think LG Polymers, which there was I think a petition in the court as well, but the government actually was able to show that yes, there was an environmental clearance to this particular plant. Eventually they did show that. But yes, I mean, in the first instance, the reporting was that they don't have a clearance. So this is perhaps how, this is also a loophole, I feel, in the law itself, right? Breaking down the project into smaller parts and then showing them as independent projects and then saying that, okay, they don't actually require an EIA. And how did the SPCB then go ahead and grant this thing? On the second question, I think very quickly about, self-declaration of pollution. I don't know. I mean, even after an environmental clearance is granted, the project proponent has to continuously report as to whether they're complying with the environmental clearance or not, the conditions in the environmental clearance. And I think Shivani Ghosh, in her piece, she writes about how this compliance rate is really, low, and compliance rate is low, and reporting rate on whether they're complying or not is also very low. So I don't think there should be a lot of, personally, I don't think there should be a lot of dependence as such on the project proponent. And I align with Tish when she says that, this model, I'm not sure how much will this work of self-reporting. But that's just my 2 cents on it. Very quickly.
Thank you so much, Kanika. So we have overshot our time by a little bit. We'll just take one last question from a student. Suyash, please go ahead. You can unmute yourself.
Hello, ma'am. It was a great session to be a part of. And so I have a small question. Does the orders given by the court really be implemented at the ground level? So like there are political agendas as well, like we see in the NBA case where the government deal was also at the stake. So they try to just focus on their own deal rather than the environment.
I'm sorry, I didn't quite catch the question there. Would you mind repeating that?
Sure, ma'am. So basically, like sometimes the order given by the court are not really be implemented at the ground level. Like there are political agendas also connected with that, like in the case of NBA. The government deal was also at the stake because their money was at stake, and so they try to like avoid the environment and they try to focus on their own benefits.
Mm-hmm. I'm going to pass this question on to Kanika because I'm not familiar with the case.
Yeah. Thank you, Suyash. So see whether the orders of the court are implemented or not, and I'm going to be drawing upon Tish's answer here on the little bit of conversation we had in political economy. So the larger question as to whether court orders are implemented or not. In NBA, the court decided that we are granting a clearance. Where Sardar Sarovar is going to be built, and with each subsequent each increase in the height of the dam, you are going to then you first have to relocate the community, resettle the community before you kind of do that. Now, the court did actually go on and form a resettlement body also that was responsible for all of this resettlement and relocation. But that wasn't as such. Even today, if you just Google Medha Patankar and her struggle with NBA, there are still resettlements that have not happened. The court said that the community should be happy with the site that they're being resettled to. But there is actually an overwhelming amount of data which shows that the community wasn't very happy with the alternate resettlement sites, right? So a lot of these, and then when you look at NBA from a political economy understanding, you will also realize that the decision itself on points of law was somewhere you can critique it on points of law. For example, the application of the precautionary principle. I don't want to take this into a completely legal decision, legal conversation, but political and economic factors definitely, which is why, like Tish and I were talking earlier, that you have to understand all of these environmental issues in a larger political and economic context. And court orders, the Supreme Court in India has terrific environmental jurisprudence, but at the end of the day, I think it comes down to what Tish was saying, the willingness to actually then implement it and abide by it. The court can only do so much. At the end of the day, it also comes down to the people and how much they want to abide by it.
Thank you. Thank you, Kanika. Thank you so much, Tish and Kanika. Now we've come to an end. I'm sorry we won't be able to take any more questions. But thanks a lot, Tish and Kanika, for joining us today. Tish, your work is so fascinating in terms of very briefly. I wanted to just like highlight to the student body specifically that is present here the importance of investigative journalism in environmental law. You know, the project that you have specifically worked on over here, the way this was data driven and how you beautifully, you know, you weaved in narrative storytelling with this. And I've shared that piece with all of our participants in the chat. I would really request you all to go and also have a look at it. And this is so important for us as academics who, you know, we discuss and we have conversations with our students and on platforms like this to show the ground reality and to actually understand how weak the legal safeguards are. So thank you so much, Tish, for sharing your knowledge with us and the university and all of our friends here. Thank you so much, Kanika, for being a beautiful and absolutely wonderful discussant for us today. Thank you, everyone. Thanks a lot for joining. I wish you all a very good evening.
Thank you very much for having me. It was a real pleasure to discuss with you, Kanika. And if any students would like to get in touch just to ask any questions at all about environmental journalism, you can find me on Twitter as Tish Sanghera, and I'm very happy to have a chat at any time.